Hello there, and welcome to the last session, or the last review that we're going to have on our different aviation topics that you're going to be covering on your exam next week. This last topic is also on engines, like our previous class. This is going to be focusing more on oil purposes and fuel. It's going to be another short one, shouldn't be longer than 15 to 20 minutes. If this video is time-stamped as like 30, 40 minutes or something, I apologize. All right, so just to review, four-stroke engines have their four strokes. We have our intake, we have compression, we have ignition, and we have exhaust. Those are the four strokes, and just remember the way that the engine moves. Our three types of combustion engines are radial, inline, and horizontally opposed. And basically, the radial engine has some disadvantages with visibility. The inline has some disadvantages with the weight of the crankshaft, and horizontally opposed is kind of like a good middle ground. So, functions of engine oil. Engine oil has four purposes. It is used for cooling, sealing, lubricating, and flushing. So basically, oil, well, as long as it's constantly moving around through the engine, it can absorb some of that heat and get taken somewhere else. And in those cooler parts of the engine, it will equalize so that it can take on more of that heat and help more evenly disperse the thermal energy inside of that engine. It's pretty much necessary for just about any internal combustion engine. Sealing. If you can kind of imagine when you have oil and you stick your hand into the oil, when you take it out, your hand there will be like a connection between your hand where that oil is dripping down to the bucket or whatever. That's that sealing capability where the oil will stick to one thing and then something that it's in contact with, and it will help move between the two of them. And so this sealing, it reduces the wear on the engine, so make sure that it doesn't get worn down as quickly, and it helps make the engine more efficient. Lubrication. I kind of touched on this before. We've got two parts that are moving together, and there's a medium that's between them that will help serve as a bit of a cushioning to the constant moving parts. It helps make sure that they don't get worn down as easily, and it reduces heat generation as well, because if you rub your hands together really, really fast, you can feel your hands heat up. If you put water on your hands and you try that same thing, you'll notice it's very, very hard to actually get your hands to heat up properly. Flushing. Last thing, I mean, really just think of it like you would anything else when you're trying to wash things off with water, rinse stuff out. You just pour a bunch of water through it, and that water will carry away any excess contaminants and things. So in this case, it's going to be carbon buildups and other burn off from inside of the engine that gets redirected through. Metal filings as well. So as those components wear down, there can sometimes be visible pieces or even invisible that get carried away that do shave off through the motion of the parts. So methods of lubrication. We've got two main ones, wet and dry. So this is going over what a dry sump is. Oh, and I'm missing my little laser pointer here. So engine oil is contained in a tank and then pumped through the engine block. You can see here we've got our dry sump pump, and our oil tank goes through it. So the sump pump brings our oil to the oil tank, and it then goes through the filter, through its cooler, into the engine, and then comes out as well. And you can see this is color coded according to the associated temperatures with it. A wet sump is basically the same, except there's no oil tank. Instead, it kind of just sits in the bottom of the engine, and the idea is that the engine's motion will splash up that oil and lubricate those other parts. It's less complicated, so less prone to failure, but you don't get as much of a lubrication effect since it's not directed. It's just kind of hoping that it will splash up in the places that you need, and you can't fit as much of it. We're not going to go through the conformation here, but just as a brief overview. So cooling, sealing, lubrication, and flushing, those are the four purposes. Force feed is through that dry sump system, and then the splash is associated with the wet sump. And then here's just going a little bit more in depth with dry sump lubrication and wet sump. So dry sump again is where the oil is contained in a separate tank and it's forced under pressure from a pressure pump through the hollow crankshaft in order to lubricate the whole engine through force feed. And the oil pressure gets monitored by a pressure gauge. So in a sump, it's just sitting in the pan underneath the crankcase, and as it passes through, it just kind of gets splashed around to move through the oil outside the gears, and yeah. All right, so fuel and fuel systems. So there are fuel supply lines, which you can see are labeled here as number 1, but really all of these little yellow cords that you can see, those are fuel lines. Um, these fuel lines are responsible for making sure that the engine gets all of the fuel it needs, and that the levels of fuel stay equal as well. So you can see this number 2 here. The second one is the tank vent interconnect line. This is a really important one. You do need to have this in your plane, because if you are using a fuel selector valve, which is going to allow you to choose between using both fuel tanks, using just one or using both. With that, you can end up with some inconsistencies where if you accidentally draw from just one tank instead of the other, this line is going to help equalize that. And if you think about it, if you just use, let's say, this one tank here, the left tank from the pilot's perspective, if you completely drain that tank, well, first of all, you may run out of fuel halfway through your trip and not notice it, or you could end up with a weight balance, a weight imbalance, where you've got all of this weight in the second tank, where none of that fuel has been used, and it's just sitting there, and all of a sudden there's nothing to counteract it on the other side. And so obviously that can lead to some very dangerous situations. For example, if you went into a stall with that much more weight on one side, you'd be much more prone to going into a spin, as opposed to just a standard recoverable stall. So types of fuel systems. We have 2 general types, and they're kind of analogous to the types that we were discussing for our sump pumps. So for our fuel systems, we have our gravity fed, and we have our force fed. Or sorry, we have our gravity fed, which is like the force fed, and we have our fuel injected. So for our gravity feed style, we have our fuel tanks generally in the wings. That's what happens with our Cessna aircraft. And you can see we've got these little valves here where you can check fuel for contaminants before you take off. So that will just let off a little bit of fuel from the bottom. So since your engine is located just I don't know, geographically lower in the plane than the tanks, the gravity is able to pull down through the fuel lines, through the strainer, and then into the primer, and then the carburetor as well. Just to review as well, the carburetor is what's responsible for creating the air-fuel mixture. You don't just take fuel and dump it directly into the engine. So the carburetor is what disperses that. So here we can see what kind of happens below that. And so yeah, here we have our fuel pump system. So we've got our carburetor. We have our electric pump, which is responsible for making sure that there's energy going through the fuel lines to help make sure that they keep moving, and an engine-driven pump as an alternate as well, because as we've discussed before, having backups to absolutely everything is key. Here at the very bottom, you can see we've got our tanks. So these tanks can be contained within the fuselage as opposed to having to be up in the wings, or in the case of low-wing aircraft, it's necessary where you don't have that luxury of having your gravity feed as an option because of those high wings. Something that's really important though about that gravity fed system is that you can't fly upside down. Not really a major concern when it comes to general aviation, because in most cases it's illegal anyway. But yes, that is what will happen if you fly upside down. You'll end up with essentially this system, except these pumps aren't here. So now you've got all this fuel that needs to get from here to here, moving upward against gravity, and there's no way for it to practically do that. These are some examples of some gravity-fed engines. So you can see here we've got a Cessna, and we've got one of the tow planes that we use the gliding sites. So both of those use gravity-fed fuel systems. So both of them have their fuel tanks located up in their wings. And if you can see, there's actually footsteps for you to get up and check those fuel tanks from the top of the wings. Anyway, here we are with our force feed system, as we discussed before, and that's this system here on the bottom. So the fuel needs to be pumped against gravity toward the engine. It's a more complex design, so it could be more susceptible to failure, but you do have the advantage of inverted flight. So in general, this is going to be there's no real, you can't just say that one of them is necessarily safer than the others. Both of them have advantages and disadvantages in terms of safety, because this one has more moving parts, more susceptible to failure, while you've got that extra security measure where if you somehow find yourself inverted, you've got a way out of that. Yeah. In general, I remember I asked this myself when I learned about these two systems, about whether there was something like a gravity fed system with pumps attached. They are, those do exist, but in general they are more expensive and they're not very common. When you do see people do design planes with just the necessities, if you've got this here where your rule is don't fly upside down and nothing bad will happen, people will take that over adding more complex parts that could potentially cause failure. Here's just some examples of force-fed systems. So you can see here you've got the low wings where it's necessary. You don't have the ability to have higher tanks that you can pass on. And then these very, very large planes where they've got those jet engines on the side that need to have that fuel injected. So fuel tanks themselves. Fuel tanks are typically made of aluminum alloy, but they also may contain rubber or nylon bladders. If any of you are World War II history buffs, you may be familiar with self-sealing tanks, which are tanks that do have that interior lining that's designed to stop leakages if there does happen to be a bullet that passes through. Sump drains, overflow drains, screens, vents, and baffles are incorporated into most of these designs. All of these are just designed essentially to help prevent any buildups of carbon deposits and other things. You can see there's a reference page in your For the Ground Up if you do have a copy. So all of these are just to help make sure that we don't have contaminants cycling through the engine that could potentially cause damage or misfires. Aviation fuels. So we've got a couple different types of those. So how we classify them is based on octane and heptane, and their relative quantities to each other. So octane has minimum detonation qualities. It's actually more stable, and heptane is a more unstable, and so it's more prone to detonation. It will ignite quicker, and you need to have a good balance. You don't want your stuff to ignite too forcefully, but you don't want it to not ignite at all and lose that engine power. So octane numbers go up to 100 because it is a ratio. If you see a number such as 108, that 8 is the anti-knock value. You don't need to know exactly what that means, but just in practice, in case you do see it, essentially what that is it's just there's additives and stuff in it to make sure that it doesn't misfire or create that engine knocking sound that can indicate potential harm or even an oncoming engine failure. Fuel grades are expressed by two performance numbers. That first number is the octane rating at lean mixture conditions. And then secondly, we have our rich mixture. So if you've been in a powered aircraft before, there's a red knob. If you push the red knob all the way in, that's a fully rich mixture. If you pull it all the way out, the engine will die. But if you pull it out the right amount to just where that engine gets to the point where it's happy, that's the ideal lean mixture conditions. And that's just about how much octane and heptane you've got mixing with your fuel. So here's an example. We have our lean mixture performance of 100 and then a rich mixture of 130. And so this is just, again, the ratio of octane to heptane. We have two types of gas. We have avgas and we have MOGAS. There are some aircraft that are designed to operate off of MOGAS, but in general, you must use avgas. So you can't really fill up a jerry can at your local gas station and just dump that into a Cessna. Cessnas are designed to burn on avgas. Here are the different colors. So you can see there's a few different types of avgas that are colored differently. And then we've got jet fuel as well, which is this straw colored, this yellow. Cessnas generally use this 100 low lead. That's what the LL is. And they contain non-reactive dyes. So the dyes aren't going to interfere with the sequence or anything like that. In general, never use a fuel with a lower octane rating than recommended by the engine manufacturer, obviously, because this can cause overheating, detonation, and other serious engine damage. Fuel system problems. So these are things that can occur as a result of mistreating your engine. So you can end up with detonation, which can be abnormally rapid combustion, a pinging, which is kind of like a knocking, where you're hearing a sound coming from your engines, and this can be indicated by a loss of power and a really rapid rise in engine temperature. So this can happen if you use the incorrect fuel, you overheat your engine, or you lean your mixture too much. So there's not enough of that fuel inside your fuel air mixture. So yeah, pretty straightforward cures. Just make sure you're using the right fuel in your aircraft. And if your engine seems to be doing any of these things, full lean your mixture. That's always the first thing you do in case of an engine failure. Pre-ignition, so not the same as detonation. Essentially what happens is glowing carbon particles are left behind in the cylinders and cause the fuel to ignite before it's in the proper stage. And it's going to cause your engine to run really, really rough, because in that typical four-stroke engine, it's designed to ignite exactly at those given spots. And if it doesn't, then it's not properly prepared for what it needs to do. This can be caused by poor maintenance and not using the right types of oil as well. And really, the only way to do this is to make sure that you're taking the engine in for regular checkups and maintenance. This is also something that can happen vapor lock, which is where you've got really high temperatures and the fuel vaporizes inside of the fuel lines, and you're not able to get liquid fuel through because it's trapped there. This review we're not going to go over because I think we've just done it. This here is a cylinder, and you can see it's been warped. It's been visibly bent. That's meant to be straight, and that's not good. That is the end of this lesson and the end of our review. I hope you guys have all learned something, and I wish you all the best of luck on your exams next week. You guys are all going to do really, really well. Feel free to message me on Discord or shoot me an email if you have aviation-related questions. Good luck, guys.